Continuing with the economy of Europe in the 17th century, today we would look at trade and manufacture, Proto Industrialization, and the role of the merchant capitalists in the economy of Europe in the 17th century. One major feature of this century was the gradual transition of the center of trade, particularly maritime trade, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. The Baltic trade, the Baltic region and the North Sea region had been trying to adjust its industrial products and agriculture and trade to the needs of the long-distance trade. There was a certain decline in the trade of the Mediterranean powers because they still continued to depend on spices and luxury articles. The industrial superiority of these regions, of certain regions in the Mediterranean area, had declined during this period. There had been a contest in the maritime trade between the Dutch and the Portuguese in the 16th century. In the 17th century, this perspective was changed. One major reason was the change in the nature of the transatlantic trade, particularly with America. Instead of being just the supplier of bullion, America increasingly became a market for European industrial commodities and a supplier of raw materials and certain new products like cane and coffee. As a result, the rise of Holland and also of England in this maritime trade became increasingly transparent. The Dutch merchants dominated the Baltic and the North Sea trade for some time. Now, they also started to have a large share of the Atlantic trade as well. By the mid-century, the maritime trade was a matter of contest between Holland and England. Italy, Spain, and Portugal suffered a certain decline. In some ways, the Mediterranean area also became a supplier of raw material. Venice sold more than 28,000 pieces in 1602, about 15,000 pieces in 1645, but only 2,000 pieces in 1700. These figures eloquently describe the process of decline in the volume of trade. Obviously, this affected the manufacturing or production of textiles in the area as well. Florence sold 30,000 pieces between 1530 and 1580, 13,500 pieces in the last decades of the 16th century. It became only 8,000 plus by the mid-17th century. Milan in 1600 sold 15,000 pieces and had 60-70 workshops. In 1709, it sold only 1,000 pieces and had only one workshop. Silk production also similarly suffered. Between 1565 and 1675, the number of looms in Genoa came down from 10,000 to 2,500. The markets Italy lost were again to Holland and England. One reason for this decline was the arrival of what has been called new draperies. These were lighter cloths compared to the much heavier old draperies. Italy specialized in the production of old draperies. One reason for a decline here was the stoppage of the export of wool from Spain in particular. Other factors were also high tariff in France and the war in Germany. By the end of the 17th century, Spain retained only 5% of its Atlantic trade. Spain also became, in a way, supplier of raw materials. In Central Europe, the gold and copper mines experienced a decline in production. A deterioration in the relations between the Hanseatic merchants and the Portuguese merchants, and a fall in the demand of fustian cloth. All this led to a weakening of the urban economy of Central Europe. The 30 Years' War also affected both production and trade in this region. The number of workshops in Nuremberg was 1/3 of what it had been in the 16th century. In Augsburg, the number of producers of fustian cloth came down from 3,000 plus in 1612 to 468 in 1720. Total production of fustian cloth in this area came down from about 430,000 pieces to over 60,000 pieces. France also experienced decline in certain of its production centers from the 1650s or 60s. Centers like Amiens and Lille experienced a certain decline. There was a whole lot of change during this period, the most significant being the shift of the center of economy in Europe from the Mediterranean area to the north and northwest. Now we look at the process of what historians have described as Proto Industrialization. The crisis in the production led to certain structural changes in many regions of Europe. These changes were seen, curiously, in the villages or rural areas. Rise in the grain prices in the 16th century was taken advantage of by small and even marginal farmers occasionally to sell the surplus food grains in the market and to invest a part of this profit back in business. Consequently, when the prices fell in the 17th century, many of these people started supplementing their income from agriculture by resorting to artisanal or cottage industry productions. Many of the marginal farmers were obliged to sell their part of their land or whole of their land because they did not have enough surplus to invest and equip themselves for any other kind of productive activities. The number of people associated with artisanal cottage production during this period increased significantly in certain regions of Europe. This suited the larger interests of community production. When a decline in urban industry failed to meet the demands of the market, particularly of the long-distance trade. These alternate production centers, we have noted, appeared in the rural areas, and this is a process that has been called by the historians as proto-industrialization. This could happen in two ways. First, the villagers could produce commodities which they gave to the market by themselves in return for cash payment. They also invested some part of the money they earned and the profit they made in developing infrastructures. If they needed money, often money was advanced by the merchant capitalists. When the merchant capitalists advanced money required, they also reserved the right to keep or to buy the entire production. This system of buying directly from the producer was known in Germany as the Kauf system, Kaufsystem. The second method was a little different. This is where the merchant provided the money and all other tools and took the entire produce away. This system came to be known as the putting out system or the Verlags system, Verlagsystem. The driving power behind both the systems, but particularly the second system, was the figure that now came to establish himself, namely the merchant capitalist. How did he emerge? Now we have seen that when the peasants had marketable surplus, the peasants needed to take this to the urban markets. The merchants helped the peasants in doing this. They became aware of the demands for industrial products, and to meet such demands, they laid the foundation of Proto Industrialization. Eric Hobsbawm has called this the peasant road to capitalism. The merchant capitalist was the capitalist, but the role of the peasants who had made some savings and invested in artisanal production cannot be ignored in this process. This system started mainly in the Flanders, in Ghent and Ypres area. The system was also prevalent in some parts of South and West Germany in the 16th century. But in the 17th century, it spread to other parts of Europe. And we must understand that this was a response to certain demands for structural change that the economy was making. The need for more machines, the new kind of machines, for example. In southwest Germany and the Rhineland, the Verlag system had worked pretty well. For example, the point I was making about machines, iron drilling machines were required to make iron sheet and rod. These machines were expensive and the artisanal producers could not afford them. Here the merchant capitalist came in. He was willing to invest and invested. The result was that a beginning was made in the Saar Basin area, which in the 19th century became one of the most important industrial centers in Germany. The fame of the Swiss watchmakers in the Alpine areas started during this period. So the celebrated watchmaking industry in Switzerland also had its origin in the kind of structural changes which were taking place. The Dutch textile centers of Haarlem had been very, very significant. But later, this industry was tied up to the rural areas of Westphalia, and we have new centers coming up. The impact of these changes was seen most significantly in Holland, particularly in shipbuilding and cloth producing manufacturing. When the wind-powered sawmill was invented in 1596, the shipbuilding guilds decided to ignore them. As a result, the change in the shipbuilding started occurring in a cluster of villages near Amsterdam. The most important example of the clash between town-based industries and the Proto Industrialization was seen in the experience of Leiden. Flemish refugees had come and they introduced the new draperies in Leiden. Catholic Spain had by now stopped supplying wool to this region because of the Dutch revolt. This affected the production of old draperies, and the new draperies were produced by the Flemish refugees who had come because of political turmoil. But towards the end of the 17th century, the proto-industrialization shifted to other regions as well. Another remarkable success was that of England. England's export was mostly broadcloth. The textile industry suffered because the supply of wool had been affected compared to earlier. In England also, the Flemish refugees who had come from the continent helped in the beginning of the production of new draperies. In England, another significant happening was the invention of the knitting frame by William Nee in the 16th century. This expedited weaving, but the guilds in the older centers failed to adjust to the new demands and the new processes and machines. Apart from textile, another major area where England had a very significant role to play was mining, particularly coal. In course of the 17th century, there was a massive increase of about 1,400% in the production of coal in this area. The number of workers employed in the coal industry increased from around 6,000 in the early 17th century to about 15,000 by 1750. France was also affected by these changes. In France, Colbert, the economic minister of Louis XIV, the king, was particularly known for his mercantilist ideas, and he supported and subsidized companies and production to make France find some area. As a result, by the end of the 17th century, export from the French port of Marseille increased several-fold. And finally, we come to the role of the merchant capital and the changes which were being wrought. Most important was what we have noticed so far is the substitution of England and Holland in the place of Portugal and Spain in the transatlantic trade. There was a change in the structure of the transatlantic trade that I have mentioned earlier. Now, Portuguese had introduced cane production in Brazil, and that gave sugar. England had started cultivating tobacco in Virginia and Maryland. Now, all these were cash crops. They had a heavy demand for these products increasingly in Europe. But the structure of the production of these was dependent on slave system. The American indigenous people provided that slave labor. But the Europeans, alongside bringing their imperialism to America, also brought diseases. And there were several epidemics which took a heavy toll of the lives of the indigenous Americans. As a result, there was a need for an alternative source of labor, and that came from the slave labor in Africa, and thus emerged the slave trade in the transatlantic trade as an accompaniment of this trade. The Dutch had a lead in this to begin with. The Portuguese had a monopoly of slave trade earlier. The Dutch cut a slice into this, but later England and France had also been significant players in this trade. The Royal African Company that England had set up, on an average, brought about 2,327 slaves over a period of more than a century. Thus, the trade that now emerged was a three-way trade: America, Europe, Africa. Because from Africa they also imported gold and ivory. Now, in all this, there was a change in the organization of business. The Asian trade was added to this to make it a four-way trade. And this indeed led to the establishment or consolidation of what has been called the European world system, which started emerging from the 16th century. Now, this trade, whose volume was increasing, also involved a greater degree of risk. And that risk, it was impossible very often for an individual to bear. The way out to the formation of companies, joint stock companies. Portugal and Spain had led the way there also. Casa de Contratación, the Spanish company, or Casa de India, the Portuguese company, they were state-subsidized, state-promoted companies. On the other hand, the English East India Company, which came in 1600, or the Dutch East Indies Company, which came a little later, had been different. They were companies promoted by private capital, and they were known as joint stock companies. With the rise of Holland and England in this trade, this worldwide trade system, Spain and Portugal had a receding position. The Spanish ships carried 22,000 odd tons of goods in the Atlantic between 1641 and 1650. It came down to 4,950 tons in the last decade of the 17th century. During the same period, the number of Dutch ships going to Asia increased from 29 to 241. The number of English ships rose from 20 to 134. The French ships rose from only 2 to 40. England's major role was in another type of trading, which was known as re-export. They brought commodities from the new areas, Atlantic, Asia, or even Africa, and re-exported them to the continental markets. This gave England a particularly prime position in the trade in Europe during this period. A final point that we might make is that Amsterdam now had become the most important place of exchange. It was the capital of the capital market in Europe. It was a place where exchanges were made. Governments sold their bonds in the Amsterdam market. Antwerp had a position of privilege in the 16th century. Amsterdam took it in the 17th century. Its population had grown from about 30,000 in the 1560s to 200,000 by the late 17th century. Amsterdam broke the monopoly of the Genoese bankers and many other earlier operators or players in the economic sphere. One major cause of this was the foundation of the Wisselbank, the bank in Amsterdam that the Dutch had been able to establish. Banking was a new experience, a new institution that facilitated credit, facilitated exchange, and facilitated loan of capital, and thus favored trade. There were also innovations like bills of exchange. This minimized the risk factor in long-distance trade. All these innovations made Amsterdam the financial capital of Europe. Amsterdam was overtaken by London towards the end of the 17th century. England had commercial links with America, the Caribbean region, with Asia through the East India Company, and also other regions. England emerged as the largest commercial power by the end of the 17th century. And by this time, London became the financial capital of Europe, somewhat replacing Amsterdam's earlier privilege in this respect. London became also the center of world trade in a way. The Bank of England had come in 1696, and this greatly helped the reorganization of England's economy, England's finances, England's capital flow, etc., and facilitated England's emergence as the major commercial power, not just in Europe, but in the world. These then are the basic changes that we see over the century. The 17th century is also called a period of crisis. Was there a general crisis here? There are many views about this. We shall try and discuss this in another lecture.